In the deadliest winter storm ever recorded in Montana's history, a former military survival expert faces an impossible choice: break every rule of wilderness safety he knows, or watch as a mother bear and her cubs freeze to death on his doorstep. What happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals. The digital thermometer on James Cooper's cabin wall flashed 52 degrees, a temperature so cold it seemed to mock everything he'd learned in 15 years of wilderness survival training. In his decade of living in Montana's remote Bitterroot Mountains, he'd never seen anything like this. The approaching storm system wasn't just another winter challenge. It was a killer. James stood at his reinforced window, watching as the wind bent century-old pines like they were saplings. His weather station's display blinked with an urgent warning. Unprecedented Arctic blast approaching. Estimated wind speeds 85 mph. Seek immediate shelter. At 42, after serving 12 years as a Special Forces survival instructor, James thought he'd seen nature at its worst. He was about to discover how wrong he was. His cabin, perched at 8,500 feet in one of Montana's most isolated regions, was the only human structure for 30 miles in any direction. The nearest town, a small settlement called Shadow Creek, lay a treacherous 6-hour drive away, and that was in good weather. Tonight, with what was coming, it might as well have been on another planet. The morning had started deceptively calm. James had gone through his usual routine, developed through years of military precision and wilderness experience. He'd checked his solar battery banks, tested his emergency communications equipment, and taken inventory of his supplies. His cabin, though modest in size, was a fortress against the elements, built to military specifications with redundant safety systems. The walls of his living room were lined with topographical maps and weather charts, interspersed with photographs of his time in the service. Unlike the peaceful nature shots that many cabin dwellers displayed, these images told stories of survival. Training in the world's harshest environments, the Arctic Circle, the Mojave Desert, the Panamanian jungle. Each represented a lesson learned, often the hard way. His sat phone buzzed, a rare occurrence this deep in the wilderness. The message was from his old commanding officer. Cooper, incoming system worse than predicted, multiple weather stations. Down. Stay put. James allowed himself a grim smile. Staying put wasn't just the plan, it was the only option. As darkness approached, the storm announced itself with a sound James had never heard before, a deep, resonant howl that seemed to come from the mountain itself. The wind picked up speed, and the temperature continued its relentless plunge. His reinforced windows creaked under the pressure, and the solar panels on his roof rattled ominously despite their heavy-duty mounting. James moved with practiced efficiency, activating his backup heating system and double-checking his emergency protocols. His military training had taught him that survival wasn't just about having the right supplies, it was about anticipating what could go wrong before it did. He'd stored extra firewood in his interior room, filled his backup water containers, and positioned his emergency equipment for easy access in the dark. The satellite weather feed on his laptop showed the storm system as an angry red mass, unlike anything the regional weather service had recorded in its 70-year history. This wasn't just a winter storm, it was a polar vortex that had broken free from its Arctic constraints, bringing with it temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in seconds. As night fell, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The wind found every microscopic gap in the cabin's construction, creating an eerie whistling that seemed to carry words just beyond understanding. James checked his watch, 19 hours. The storm was expected to peak around midnight, but already the conditions outside were deteriorating faster than predicted. Then he heard it, a sound that made him instantly alert, his military training kicking in. A deep, resonant moan carried through the howling wind, followed by something that shouldn't have been possible in these conditions, the distinct sound of claws on wood. Something was out there, something big, and it was close to his cabin. James grabbed his military-grade thermal imaging device, a piece of equipment that had saved his life more than once during his Special Forces days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Now back to the story. Through the green glow of the screen, he saw them, 3 distinct heat signatures, rapidly losing their brightness as their body temperatures dropped in the lethal cold. A mother grizzly and 2 cubs, but something was terribly wrong. At this time of year, they should be deep in hibernation, their metabolisms slowed to a crawl in some protected den. Instead, they were fighting for survival in the worst storm in Montana's recorded history. The thermal imaging told a story that made James's jaw clench. The cubs' heat signatures were alarmingly weak, their core temperatures dangerously low. The mother's signature was stronger, but even her massive body was losing the battle against the cold. The wind chill had pushed the effective temperature to nearly 70 degrees, conditions that no living creature was meant to endure. His training kicked in as he assessed the situation. The bears had likely been driven from their den by something, perhaps a collapse due to the extreme weather, or maybe another predator. Whatever the cause, they were now in the worst possible situation, exposed to elements that would kill them within hours. The mother bear's movements were becoming increasingly erratic. Through his thermal scope, James could see her attempting to shield her cubs from the wind, positioning her massive body as a barrier between them and the deadly gusts. It was a losing battle. The cubs' heat signatures were growing fainter by the minute. James's mind raced through his survival training. In the military, he'd taught hundreds of soldiers how to avoid and handle bear encounters. The first rule was always the same: maintain maximum safe distance. Bears near human structures were considered a code red situation, absolutely no engagement allowed. But there was another side to his training, one that went deeper than just survival protocols. In the Special Forces, he'd learned that sometimes the rule book had to be thrown out when extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. He'd once risked his life to save a trapped mountain climber in conditions everyone else had deemed unsurvivable. His commanding officer had later asked him why he'd taken such a risk. His answer had been simple: because I could help. The wind howled with renewed fury, and through his thermal scope, James watched as one of the cubs collapsed into the snow. Its heat signature was now barely distinguishable from the frozen ground. The mother bear's desperate attempts to rouse were growing weaker, her own strength failing. James had a heated storage unit attached to his cabin, originally built to house his extensive collection of survival gear and military equipment. It was separate from his living space, with its own entrance and heavy-duty insulation. It could serve as an emergency shelter, but getting 3 freezing bears into it would be a mission more dangerous than any he'd undertaken in his military career. If the mother bear panicked, she could tear through his defenses like they were a paper. Even in her weakened state, her maternal instincts could trigger a burst of lethal strength. His cabin would be compromised, leaving them all to freeze in the unprecedented storm. Even if they survived the night, having 3 bears close to his living space violated every principle of wilderness safety he'd ever learned or taught. The second cub fell, its small body disappearing beneath the rapidly accumulating snow. The mother bear let out a sound that cut through the howling wind and straight to James's core, a sound of pure desperation that transcended species. Through his thermal scope, he could see her heat signature weakening as she tried to dig her cubs out of the snow, her movements becoming increasingly sluggish. Time was running out. In these conditions, the cubs would be dead within minutes, the mother following shortly after. James Cooper, who had survived 3 tours in combat zones and trained hundreds in wilderness survival, faced a decision that no training manual had ever covered. The next few moments would either prove him a fool or remind him why he'd chosen this life of isolation in the first place, to understand what it truly meant to be part of the natural world, not just an observer of it. James switched his thermal imager to recording mode, a habit ingrained from his years of tactical operations. If things went wrong, at least there would be a record of what happened. The temperature reading on his device showed the cubs' core temperatures dropping into critical range. He had maybe 10 minutes before their conditions became irreversible. Moving with the calculated precision that had kept him alive in combat zones, James began his preparation sequence. His mind shifted into mission planning mode, breaking down the impossible task into manageable objectives. First priority: creating a controlled environment for the rescue attempt. He activated the emergency heating system in his storage unit, watching through the thermal imager as the room's temperature signature gradually brightened. The space had originally been designed to store temperature-sensitive military equipment, high-end communications gear, survival supplies, and medical equipment. Now it would serve a very different purpose. From his emergency medical kit, James retrieved several chemical heating packs, military-grade ones, designed for treating hypothermia in extreme conditions. He'd seen these same packs save the lives of soldiers trapped in mountain snowstorms. They could generate heat for up to 8 hours, long enough to help stabilize the bear's core temperatures if he could get them inside. His sat phone buzzed again. Another message from his former CO. Cooper, meteorological stations going dark across the region. Temperature drops unprecedented. Stay secure. James tucked the phone away. What he was about to attempt went against everything he'd ever taught about wilderness survival, but his training had also taught him something else. Sometimes the riskiest course of action was the only moral one. Through the thermal scope, he watched the mother bear's desperate attempts to protect her cubs. Her movements reminded him of something he'd seen in Afghanistan, a local shepherd who'd used his own body to shield his flock during a sudden mountain storm. That shepherd hadn't survived, but his actions had taught James something about the universal nature of sacrifice. James began laying out his equipment with military precision. Tranquilizer gun, loaded with sedative doses calculated for each bear's estimated weight. Emergency medical supplies, heavy-duty protective gear, and industrial-strength restraints. If by some miracle he got them inside, he'd need to be prepared for when they woke up. The wind slammed against his cabin with renewed fury, and his weather station blared another warning. Wind speeds exceeding 90 mpm, conditions deteriorating. The mother bear's attempts to rouse her cubs were becoming weaker. Through the thermal imager, James could see her own heat signature fading. Even her massive body couldn't withstand these temperatures for much longer. Drawing on his special forces training, James ran through the mission parameters in his head. Best-case scenario, he could get all 3 bears into the storage unit before they froze to death. Worst case, the mother bear's protective instincts would overcome her exhaustion, and he'd have an enraged grizzly tearing his cabin apart. Either way, the next few minutes would determine all their fates. He thought about his old unit's motto: "The impossible only takes longer." Well, he didn't have longer. The cubs were nearly buried in snow now, their heat signatures barely visible. Through his scope, the mother bear's movements had become painfully slow, her massive frame swaying as she tried to stand guard over her dying cubs. James checked his backup generator one last time. If the power failed during this attempt, they'd all freeze. The generator's steady hum provided a counterpoint to the howling wind, a reminder that some things were still under his control. He'd faced impossible situations before, but never one where failure meant watching death arrive in slow motion through a thermal scope. The time for planning was over. James grabbed his cold weather gear, the same type he'd used during Arctic warfare training. As he suited up, his mind flashed back to his instructor's words. In extreme conditions, survival isn't just about equipment or training. Sometimes it's about making impossible choices and living with the consequences. Well, he was about to make an impossible choice. The mother bear's eyes met his through the window, and in that moment, James Cooper, hardened Special Forces veteran, recognized something he'd seen too many times in the field, the look of someone facing their last desperate option. He reached for the door handle, knowing the next few minutes would either validate or violate everything he'd ever learned about survival in the wilderness. The door's seal broke with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the frozen air. James stepped out onto his reinforced porch, moving with the calculated precision that had kept him alive during countless military operations. The wind hit him like a physical blow, and his tactical gear's temperature sensors immediately began flashing warning signals. Even through his advanced cold weather gear, the cold cut like a knife. His thermal imaging device showed the bear's heat signatures growing dangerously faint. The cubs were now barely distinguishable from the surrounding snow, their core temperatures approaching the point of no return. The mother bear's signature was stronger, but flickering like a dying flame. Years of combat experience had taught James to recognize when he was looking at the final moments of life. These bears were right on that threshold. Drawing on his Arctic warfare training, James began implementing what he mentally dubbed Operation Thaw. First objective, establish a safe approach vector. He activated the portable floodlights he'd installed around his porch, military-grade LEDs designed to pierce through the worst weather conditions. The lights cut through the swirling snow, creating a clear path to the storage unit door. The mother bear's reaction to the sudden illumination was barely perceptible, a slight lift of her massive head, nostrils flaring weakly as she caught his scent. In his thermal scope, James could see that her body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. Under normal circumstances, a bear this close would be showing signs of aggression, but the cold had sapped her strength to the point where survival instincts were overriding her natural fear and hostility. James began deploying his thermal barriers. Lightweight but highly insulative, military-grade blankets developed for Arctic rescue operations. He'd used similar equipment to save hypothermic soldiers in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The wind kept trying to tear the blankets from his hands, but his training took over, each movement precise, each step calculated. The first cub was almost completely buried now. Through his thermal scope, James could see its heat signature flickering like a candle in the wind. The second cub wasn't much better, its small body curled tightly against its mother's increasingly cold bulk. The mother bear's attempts to shield them had become weak, uncoordinated movements that spoke of rapidly approaching unconsciousness. His sat phone vibrated again, likely another warning from his CO. But James ignored it. He was fully committed. Now, operating in that focused state he'd known in combat, where nothing existed except the mission and its objectives. The temperature on his tactical gear's display showed 75 degrees with wind chill. Even with his advanced equipment, he could feel the cold trying to shut down his body. Using his tactical training, James began creating a heated corridor between the bears and the storage unit door. He deployed more thermal barriers, anchoring them against the wind with specialized stakes designed for Arctic conditions. The military-grade heating packs he placed along the path began to create a narrow channel of survivable temperature, a lifeline in the killing cold. The mother bear's eyes tracked his movements, but there was no energy left for fear or aggression. In his thermal scope, James could see her heat signature continuing to fade. Her massive body trembled with each breath, and her attempts to check on her cubs had become increasingly weak. The cold was winning its battle against even her incredible survival instincts. Time was running out. James's tactical gear was reporting dangerous temperature drops despite its advanced protection. If he was feeling the cold through this equipment, the bears had minutes at most. He needed to act now, but one wrong move could trigger the mother bear's last reserves of strength in a lethal burst of protective fury. Drawing on years of experience in impossible situations, James began the final phase of his approach. Every step was measured, every movement smooth and non-threatening. He'd once talked his team through a minefield in the dark. This required the same level of precision and control. One mistake now wouldn't just cost him his life. It would doom the bears as well. The wind screamed around him as he moved closer to the bears, his thermal imaging device providing crucial data about their deteriorating condition. The mother bear's eyes met his, and in them, James saw something he recognized from his years in special forces, the look of someone who had reached their absolute limit, but refused to abandon those under their protection. The moment of truth had arrived. James reached for the tranquilizer gun at his hip, a last resort he hoped he wouldn't need. In these temperatures, sedation could be fatal, pushing their already stressed bodies past the breaking point. His training had taught him that sometimes the riskiest option was to take no precautions at all. Through his thermal scope, he watched as the larger cub's heat signature began to fade dramatically. The mother bear, in a desperate attempt to help, tried to stand but collapsed back into the snow, her own strength finally failing. The smaller cub hadn't moved in several minutes, though its heat signature still showed a faint spark of life. James activated his body camera, another piece of military hardware he'd kept from his service days. If he survived this, the footage would be invaluable for understanding bear behavior in extreme conditions. If he didn't, at least there would be a record of what happened. Beginning rescue attempt. He spoke into the camera's microphone, his voice steady despite the situation. Subjects are 3 Ursus Arctos horribilis, all critical condition from exposure. The wind had reached a fever pitch, screaming around the cabin like a living thing. His tactical gear's external sensors were registering wind speeds over 100 mph, hurricane force. The snow had become so dense that even his military-grade lights barely penetrated it. Without the thermal imaging, he would have lost sight of the bears entirely. Moving with deliberate calm, James deployed his last set of thermal barriers, creating a protected space around the bears. The mother's eyes followed his movements, but there was no energy left for fear. Her massive body shuddered with each breath, and ice had formed thick crusts on her fur. The cubs were nearly buried now, their small forms almost invisible under the mounting snow. His combat medical training kicked in as he assessed their condition. Severe hypothermia, probable frostbite, likely organ stress from the extreme cold. In humans, he'd have minutes at most to intervene. In bears, whose bodies were built for cold, but not this level of extreme temperature, he could only guess at the timeline. James activated his emergency beacon, a military-grade distress signal that would alert search and rescue if things went wrong. The signal probably wouldn't get through the storm, but it was protocol. Then he did something that went against every survival protocol he'd ever learned or taught. He removed his outer tactical glove. The cold hit his exposed hand like a blow, but he needed the dexterity. From his medical kit, he pulled out military-grade warming packs, the kind designed for treating hypothermic soldiers in Arctic conditions. He needed the bears to recognize these as a source of heat, to understand he was offering help rather than threat. The mother bear's nostrils flared weakly as he activated the first pack, the chemical reaction producing immediate heat. Her head lifted slightly, survival instinct responding to the promise of warmth. James placed the pack near, but not touching her, letting her make the choice. Through his thermal scope, he watched as her heat signature responded to the proximity of warmth. His tactical training had taught him to always maintain situational awareness, so he kept track of multiple factors at once: the wind direction, The bear's positions, his distance from both the cabin and storage unit doors, the temperature readings from his gear. One wrong move now could trigger defensive instincts that even hypothermia hadn't fully suppressed. The smaller cub suddenly shifted, a tiny movement that his thermal scope caught immediately. Its heat signature was dangerously weak, but it was responding to the nearby warmth. The mother bear made a sound, not the threatening growl he'd been trained to watch for, but something softer, almost pleading. James knew this was the crucial moment. Everything he'd learned in Special Forces about critical decision points told him so. In combat, there were moments when you had to commit fully or abort entirely. No middle ground. This was one of those moments. The bears would either accept his help, or their final reserves of energy would turn into lethal defensive aggression. He thought of all the training scenarios he'd run, all the survival situations he'd taught others to handle. None of them covered anything like this. The mother bear's eyes met his again, and in that moment, James made his decision. Sometimes, he realized, survival meant throwing away the rulebook entirely. With the deliberate movements of a bomb disposal expert, James began the most dangerous phase of his rescue attempt. His body camera continued recording as he activated more chemical heating packs, creating a pathway of warmth through the killing cold. The mother bear's eyes never left him, but her gaze held something beyond mere animal awareness, a desperate intelligence born of maternal instinct. His tactical gear's sensors were now flashing critical warnings. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and the wind chill pushed it well beyond anything his equipment was rated to handle. Even through his advanced cold-weather gear, he could feel the cold trying to shut down his body. His exposed hand had already lost most of its feeling, the skin turning an alarming shade of white. The larger cub suddenly convulsed, a violent shiver that his thermal scope captured in alarming detail. The movement seemed to trigger something in the mother bear. She attempted to rise again, but her legs buckled beneath her massive weight. The snow around her had begun to form an icy crust, literally freezing her in place. James activated his throat microphone, continuing to document everything. Mother showing signs of severe hypothermia. Cubs critical, implementing emergency protocol Delta 7. Delta 7 had been his unit's code for operating beyond standard procedures, a protocol reserved for situations where the rulebook no longer applied. Using his remaining thermal barriers, he created a semi-protected space around the bears. The military-grade material cut through the worst of the wind, creating a pocket where the heating packs could work more effectively. His thermal scope showed a slight improvement in the ambient temperature within the protected space, not enough to save them, but enough to buy precious minutes. The smaller cub hadn't moved in over 10 minutes, but its heat signature still showed core temperature readings just above fatal levels. The mother bear's attempts to check on her cubs had become weaker, her movements uncoordinated. Ice crystals had formed around her eyes, and her breathing had become shallow and irregular. James knew from his combat medical training that he was watching the final stages of severe hypothermia. In humans, this phase was followed quickly by organ failure and death. He had treated soldiers in similar conditions during mountain warfare training, but bears were different. Their bodies were designed to handle cold, which meant by the time they showed these symptoms, they were far closer to death than a human would be. The wind suddenly intensified, nearly knocking him off his feet. His tactical gear's anemometer registered a gust of 115 mph before the sensor itself froze. The temperature reading on his thermal scope had dropped so low that the digital display was beginning to malfunction, the numbers flickering erratically. Making a decision that went against every survival protocol he'd ever learned, James removed his outer tactical jacket. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he forced himself to keep moving. He laid the jacket, with its advanced insulation and heating elements still active, across the cubs. Their mother watched him, her eyes showing a clarity that hadn't been there before. Through his thermal scope, he could see the jacket's heat signature creating a small bubble of warmth around the cubs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It wasn't much, but it was enough to elicit a response. The larger cub moved slightly, pressing closer to its sibling. The mother bear made a sound, different from anything James had heard in his years of wilderness experience. Not a growl or a moan, but something almost like a whimper. His body temperature was dropping dangerously without his outer layer, but his combat training helped him push through the pain. He had minutes at most before the cold would begin to impair his judgment. The bears needed to be moved now, or none of them would survive the night. The mother bear's eyes met his again, and in that moment, James saw something that transcended the natural barrier between humans and wildlife. It was the same look he'd seen in the eyes of wounded soldiers who knew their survival depended entirely on trusting their medic, a desperate surrender of natural instinct to the promise of help. Everything James had learned about bear behavior told him the next few moments would be the most dangerous of his life. Moving hypothermic animals was risky enough. He'd once seen a seemingly unconscious wolf snap back to awareness with lethal speed during a rescue operation. But these were grizzly bears, and no amount of cold could completely suppress their defensive instincts. His thermal imaging device showed the cub's heat signatures strengthening slightly under his tactical jacket, but it wasn't enough. The mother bear's core temperature continued to drop, and ice crystals were forming in her fur at an alarming rate. The wind had created snow drifts around them that were rapidly becoming an icy tomb. James activated his backup floodlights, positioned strategically around the storage unit entrance. The sudden illumination caused the mother bear to stir, her massive head lifting slightly. Through his thermal scope, he could see her muscles tensing, a last reserve of strength that could either save them or kill him. Initiating emergency. Transport, he spoke into his throat mic, continuing to document everything. Subjects showing severe hypothermia. Time is critical. His words were partially lost in the howling wind, but the camera would catch them. If things went wrong, at least there would be a record of why he'd attempted something so dangerous. Drawing on his special forces training in animal handling, originally designed for working with military dogs in combat zones, James began moving the thermal barriers into a corridor formation. Each movement was slow, deliberate, non-threatening. The mother bear tracked him with her eyes, but the cold had dulled her usual aggressive response to human proximity. The smaller cub hadn't moved in nearly 20 minutes, but its heat signature showed it was still alive, barely. The larger cub had managed to press closer to its sibling under the tactical jacket, their combined body heat creating a small pocket of warmth. It wasn't enough to save them, but it told James they were still fighting for survival. Suddenly, his tactical gear's proximity sensor blared a warning. The storm had driven something else out of the forest. His thermal scope picked up multiple heat signatures moving through the trees. Wolves. The extreme cold had made them desperate enough to approach his cabin, drawn perhaps by the scent of the bears. The mother bear sensed them too. Despite her weakened state, she tried to rise, her maternal instincts triggering one last surge of energy. The movement caused her to collapse again, but her message to the wolves was clear. She would fight to the death to protect her cubs. The wolf pack held their distance, but their presence added another deadly complication to an already impossible situation. James knew he had to move fast. The wolves wouldn't approach while he was there, but if he took too long with the rescue, they might decide the risk was worth the potential reward. He'd seen wolves bring down larger prey in these mountains, and in these conditions, even a weakened grizzly wasn't safe. Using the last of his military-grade heating packs, he created a warm path leading directly to the storage unit door. The temperature differential was enough to melt the snow slightly, giving them a clearer route through. The drifts. The mother bear's eyes followed his movements, her gaze shifting between him and the lurking wolves. His own condition was deteriorating rapidly without his tactical jacket. The cold had numbed most of his exposed skin, and he could feel his core temperature dropping to dangerous levels. The thermal scope's display was becoming harder to read as his eyes struggled to focus, the first sign of hypothermia affecting his cognitive functions. The wolves' heat signatures moved closer, their desperate hunger overcoming their natural caution. The mother bear let out a weak growl, a shadow of her usual threatening roar, but enough to make the pack hesitate. James knew this standoff wouldn't last long. Soon, the cold would make all their decisions for them. James's tactical training had taught him that when multiple threats converge, prioritization becomes critical. Right now, the cold was still the primary killer. The wolves were secondary, though their presence had turned an already desperate situation into something far more complex. His thermal scope showed the pack spreading out in a hunting formation, their heat signatures bright against the frozen landscape. Making a rapid tactical decision, he reached for his emergency flare gun. The wolves wouldn't attack while he was present, but he needed a more permanent deterrent. The red flare arced through the night, its light reflecting off the swirling snow and creating an eerie crimson glow. The wolves' heat signatures retreated slightly, their instinctive fear of fire overriding their hunger. The mother bear's reaction to the flare was minimal, a bad sign. In his experience with wildlife rescue, when a large predator stopped reacting to sudden stimuli, they were approaching complete system failure. Her body temperature had dropped even further, and ice crystals were forming around her nose with each labored breath. Through his thermal scope, he noted that the cub's condition had stabilized slightly under his tactical jacket, but they needed more. His military medical training told him they were in the final stages of severe hypothermia, the deceptive phase where the body stops shivering and a false sense of warmth precedes death. Implementing emergency extraction, he spoke into his throat mic, his voice hoarse from the cold. Multiple hostile contacts, subjects critical, proceeding with high-risk transport. The words were automatic, ingrained from years of mission, reporting, but they helped focus his thoughts as hypothermia began to affect his own cognitive functions. The larger cub suddenly moved, a weak attempt to burrow deeper under the tactical jacket. The movement seemed to trigger something in the mother bear. She made one last attempt to rise, her massive frame trembling with the effort. This time, she managed to get her front legs under her before collapsing again, her strength finally spent. James's own condition was deteriorating rapidly. Without his tactical jacket, the killing cold was working its way through his remaining layers. His exposed skin had gone from painful to numb, a dangerous sign he recognized from his Arctic warfare training. He had minutes at most before the cold would begin seriously impacting his decision-making ability. The wolves had regrouped, their heat signatures showing they were moving to flank his position. The flare's deterrent effect wouldn't last long against their desperate hunger. Through his thermal scope, he could see them communicating through subtle body language, a coordinated hunting pattern he'd studied during his wilderness survival courses. Making another tactical decision, he activated his backup generators, external lights, powerful LED arrays normally reserved for emergency repairs. The sudden flood of illumination caused the wolves to retreat further, buying him precious minutes. The mother bear barely reacted to the light, but her eyes remained fixed on him, showing an awareness that transcended her physical condition. His tactical gear's temperature sensors were now registering numbers below their designed limits. The digital display flickered and died, leaving him to rely on his training and instincts. Ice had begun forming on his remaining gear, the moisture, from his breath freezing instantly on any exposed surface. The smaller cub hadn't moved in over 30 minutes, but its heat signature still showed a faint core temperature reading. The larger cub had managed to partially shield its sibling, an echo of their mother's protective instinct. The mother bear watched their minimal movements with fading awareness, her own life force draining away in the relentless cold. Time had run out. The wolves were regrouping, the bears were dying, and his own body was approaching its limits. James knew from his combat experience that in situations like this, hesitation was fatal. Sometimes survival meant acting before you were completely ready, moving before you had a perfect plan. Drawing on his years of tactical experience, James implemented what his unit had called a multiple threat extraction, a technique for moving injured comrades while maintaining defensive positions. Of course, they'd never designed it for moving 3 hypothermic grizzly bears, but the principles were the same: controlled movement, constant awareness, and decisive action. His first focus had to be the cubs. They were smaller, more vulnerable, and closer to death. Their heat signatures had weakened further, barely visible even through his military-grade thermal scope. The wolves' presence had actually created an unexpected advantage. The mother bear's protective instincts were keeping her conscious despite her deteriorating condition. James deployed his final set of thermal barriers, creating a protected corridor leading to the storage unit. The military-grade material cut through the worst of the wind, creating a temporary shelter that might give them a fighting chance. He positioned more chemical heating packs along the route, creating a trail of warmth through the killing cold. The wolves had split into 2 groups, their heat signatures showing classic pack-hunting behavior. Through his thermal scope, he could see them moving in coordinated patterns, testing his defenses. The lead wolf, likely the alpha, had positioned the pack to cut off potential escape routes. Even in these extreme conditions, their hunting instincts remained sharp. Moving with deliberate precision, James approached the cubs. The mother bear's eyes tracked him, but her head remained lowered. She had no strength left for aggression. His combat medical training told him this was a dangerous sign. Even in their weakened state, wild animals were most unpredictable when they felt their young were threatened. The larger cub stirred weakly as he knelt beside them. Ice had formed, thick crusts on their fur. Despite the protection of his tactical jacket, the smaller cub wasn't moving at all, but its heat signature showed it was still alive, barely. James knew from his wilderness medicine courses that young animals could sometimes survive extreme cold better than adults, their smaller bodies requiring less energy to warm. Using techniques adapted from his Arctic rescue training, he began to carefully slide the tactical jacket, cubs and all, toward the storage unit. Every movement was measured, every shift calculated to maintain the small pocket of warmth around their bodies. The mother bear made a soft sound, not a growl, but something more desperate. The wolves seized this moment to move closer, their heat signatures brightening as they prepared to attack. James reached for his second emergency flare with his free hand. His movements hampered by the cold. His own coordination was failing. Hypothermia was setting in despite his remaining protective gear. He fired the flare in a wide arc, creating a temporary barrier of light and heat between them and the wolf pack. The mother bear's survival instincts kicked in at the wolves' approach. With tremendous effort, she managed to rise to her feet, swaying dangerously, but still massive enough to give the predators pause. Her movement cost precious energy, but it bought James the time he needed to continue moving the cubs. Through his thermal scope, he could see the cubs' heat signatures fluctuating dangerously. The movement, despite his best efforts to be gentle, was draining their remaining energy. The smaller cub had started shivering again, paradoxically a good sign. His military medical training had taught him that resuming shivering meant the body hadn't completely given up its fight against the cold. The storage unit entrance was now just 15 feet away, but in these conditions it might as well have been a mile. The wind had picked up again, driving the wind chill to levels his gear couldn't even register. Ice crystals formed in the air itself, creating a deadly beautiful display in the emergency lights. The wolves' heat signatures showed them regrouping, preparing for another approach. The mother bear took one stumbling step forward, then another, following her cub's slow progress toward safety. Her movements were uncoordinated, but her maternal drive kept her going. James recognized the look in her eyes. He'd seen it in wounded soldiers who kept fighting long past what should have been physically possible, driven by something beyond mere survival instinct. The final 15 feet to the storage unit became a gauntlet of competing threats. The wolves had begun testing his flare barrier, their heat signatures showing coordinated movement patterns that James recognized from his wildlife combat training. They were looking for weak points, waiting for an opportunity. The cold had made them bold. These weren't the cautious predators he was used to observing from a safe distance. His thermal scope captured the horror of their situation in stark detail. The cubs' heat signatures were critically weak, their small bodies barely producing enough warmth to register. The mother bear's massive frame showed alarming cold spots spreading across her core, signs of severe hypothermia that his medical training told him were approaching the point of no return. The storage unit's heating system had created a visible heat bloom on his thermal imaging, a beacon of warmth in the lethal cold. But reaching it meant exposing himself and the bears to both the full force of the wind and a potential wolf attack. His military training had taught him that the most dangerous part of any rescue was the final approach to safety. That's when fatigue and false confidence could lead to fatal mistakes. James's own condition was deteriorating rapidly. Ice had formed inside his remaining tactical gear, and his movements were becoming clumsy as hypothermia affected his fine motor control. The cold had numbed most of his exposed skin, creating a dangerous illusion of warmth that he recognized as a sign of advancing freezing. His combat medical training screamed at him that he had minutes at most before his decision-making would be compromised. The mother bear stumbled again, nearly falling. Her heat signature showed her temperature dropping to critical levels, but somehow she kept moving, driven by something stronger than mere survival instinct. Through his thermal scope, James watched as she positioned herself between the wolf pack and her cubs, swaying on her feet, but still presenting a formidable barrier. The larger cub suddenly moved under the tactical jacket, a stronger motion than anything they'd shown in the past hour. The storage unit's warmth had reached them, triggering a response in their nearly frozen bodies. The smaller cub remained dangerously still, but its heat signature showed a faint flutter of increased heart rate. They could sense safety was near. Using the last of his coordination, James deployed his final emergency flare, creating a wider barrier between them and the wolves. The pack retreated momentarily, their heat signatures showing agitated movement patterns, but he knew they wouldn't stay back long. The cold had made them desperate enough to risk the fire and his presence. The storage unit's entrance loomed. Before them, its heavy-duty door designed to withstand both extreme weather and wildlife encounters. James had reinforced it after moving to these mountains, adding military-grade locks and insulation. Now those same security measures complicated their rescue. The door had to be opened carefully to preserve the heat inside. The mother bear's next step faltered, and she went down hard in the snow. Her heat signature flickered alarmingly, core temperature approaching levels that even her massive body couldn't sustain. But her eyes remained fixed on her cubs, watching as James maneuvered them the final few feet toward safety. His tactical training kicked in as he heard the wolves approach. They were using the wind to mask their movements, a hunting technique he'd studied but never seen in action. The mother bear heard them too, struggling to rise again, but lacking the strength. Her protective instinct was still strong, but her body had nothing left to give. The storage unit's thermal sensors registered the approaching cold front as James reached for the door handle. The cubs were now just inches from safety. But these final moments would be the most dangerous. One wrong move, one slip in his frozen state, and all of them, bears, wolves, and himself, would be locked in a deadly confrontation with no winner. The smaller cub suddenly shuddered violently under the tactical jacket, a seizure brought on by the extreme cold. The mother bear responded to her cub's distress with a sound that cut through the howling wind, a noise of pure maternal anguish that made even the approaching wolves pause. It was a sound that transcended species, a desperate plea that James understood in his bones. The storage unit door opened with a blast of warm air that momentarily overwhelmed James's thermal imaging. His military-grade scope automatically adjusted, revealing the temperature differential between the heated interior and the lethal cold outside. The cubs, still wrapped in his tactical jacket, were now just threshold away from their first real chance at survival. Using techniques adapted from his tactical extraction training, James carefully maneuvered the jacket-wrapped cubs through the doorway. The larger cub responded to the warmth immediately, its heat signature strengthening as its body registered the temperature change. The smaller one remained dangerously still, its core temperature hovering just above fatal levels. The wolves seized this moment to make their move. Through his thermal scope, James watched their heat signatures split into an attack formation, a pattern he'd studied but never seen executed in the wild. The lead wolf, larger than the others, began moving toward the fallen mother bear while the rest of the pack circled to cut off her retreat. The mother bear, despite her critically weakened state, sensed the wolves' approach. With what must have been her last reserves of strength, she pushed herself up onto her front legs. Her heat signature showed her body temperature dropping to levels that should have been fatal, but maternal instinct drove her beyond normal biological limits. Inside the storage unit, James's military hardware lined the walls, specialized equipment kept ready for any wilderness emergency. He quickly activated the secondary heating units, creating zones of warmth that his thermal scope showed, spreading across the room. The cubs needed to be warmed gradually to avoid shock, something he'd learned treating hypothermic soldiers in. The field, the wolves' attack was interrupted by an unexpected development. The smaller cub, responding to the unit's warmth, let out a weak cry. The sound galvanized its mother. James watched through his scope as her heat signature suddenly intensified, a last surge of adrenaline giving her strength she shouldn't have had. She managed to stand, her massive frame blocking the wolves' approach to the storage unit door. James's own condition was reaching critical levels. His remaining tactical gear showed warning signs he couldn't ignore. Severe hypothermia was setting in, and his training told him he had minutes at most before his judgment would be fatally impaired. The cold had penetrated to his core, making every movement a battle against his freezing muscles. The larger cub had begun shivering violently, a good sign his military medical training told him, indicating its body was fighting to warm itself. But the smaller one's condition remained critical. Its heat signature showed dangerous fluctuations that James recognized from treating extreme hypothermia cases in combat zones. They needed to warm it immediately, but too much heat too quickly could be just as fatal as the cold. Outside, the mother bear's stance was weakening again. Her heat signature showed her strength fading, the brief surge of adrenaline burning out. The wolves recognized her vulnerability, their own heat signatures intensifying as they prepared for another attack. They were using hunting tactics James had only seen documented in wildlife studies, coordinated movements designed to separate a weakened animal from any escape route. Working quickly despite his numbed hands, James activated his emergency medical gear, specialized equipment designed for treating multiple casualties in extreme conditions. He'd never used it on bears, but the principles of treating severe hypothermia remained the same across species. The cubs needed gradual rewarming to prevent their bodies from going into shock. The mother bear stumbled again, nearly falling. Her heat signature was now alarmingly weak, showing signs of imminent system failure. She was dying by inches, spending the last of her strength keeping the wolves away from her cubs. Through his thermal scope, James could see the wolves preparing for their final attack. They knew she was failing, and their desperate hunger had overcome any fear of her remaining strength. James faced an impossible choice. The cubs needed immediate medical attention, but their mother wouldn't survive another minute against the wolf pack in her condition. His military training had taught him to make rapid tactical decisions, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this situation. The next few moments would determine whether any of them survived the night. James made his decision with the cold clarity that had kept him alive through countless military operations. The mother bear's sacrifice had given him this chance. He wouldn't waste it. Grabbing his last set of specialized rescue equipment, he prepared to attempt something that violated every protocol in his wilderness training manual. His thermal scope showed the wolfpack's attack pattern with merciless precision. They had formed a deadly crescent around the mother bear, their heat signatures bright with predatory intent. The alpha wolf had positioned itself directly behind her, waiting for her inevitable collapse. These weren't just opportunistic hunters anymore. They were executing a coordinated takedown of much larger prey. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mother bear's heat signature was now dangerously faint, her massive body temperature dropping well below sustainable levels. Ice had formed thick crusts on her fur, and her breathing had become shallow and irregular. But somehow, impossibly, she remained standing between the wolves and the storage unit door, protecting her cubs with the last of her strength. Inside the unit, the cubs' conditions were stabilizing. The larger one had begun actively shivering, its body fighting to warm itself, while the smaller one showed slight improvements in its core temperature readings. The specialized heating system was working, creating a carefully controlled warming zone that wouldn't shock their systems. But James knew none of that would matter if the mother bear died. Cubs this young couldn't survive without her, no matter how much care they received. His military experience had taught him that sometimes survival meant taking calculated risks that looked like madness to anyone else. This would be one of those times. Activating his backup floodlights, powerful LED arrays normally used for emergency repairs, he created a blinding wall of light between the mother bear and the wolf pack. The sudden illumination confused the wolves' night-adapted vision, disrupting their attack formation. It was a tactical advantage, but a temporary one. The mother bear's legs finally buckled, and she went down hard in the snow. Her heat signature showed critical failure spreading through her body. Cardiac arrest would follow within minutes unless she could be warmed. The wolves recognized her collapse, their heat signatures showing increased activity as they prepared for the kill. Drawing on his Arctic warfare training, James deployed his final countermeasure. Using specialized equipment designed for extreme cold weather rescue operations, he created what his unit had called a heat corridor, a narrow pathway of survivable temperature leading to the storage unit door. It would drain the last of his backup power, but without it, the mother bear would never make it the remaining distance. The larger cub inside the unit suddenly let out a cry, a stronger sound than before, carrying clearly through the howling wind. The mother bear's response was immediate and profound. Her heat signature flared briefly, maternal instinct triggering one last surge of strength. She managed to rise again, stumbling toward the sound of her cub's call. James's own condition was deteriorating rapidly. The cold had penetrated his remaining protective gear, and his movements were becoming dangerously clumsy. His thermal scope's display blurred as his eyes struggled to focus, advanced hypothermia affecting his vision. But his training kept him moving, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought was failing. The wolves launched their attack, but the combination of blinding light and the heat corridor confused them. Their coordinated hunting pattern broke down as their instincts conflicted with the unnatural conditions. The alpha made one attempt to break through, but retreated from the intense heat, its natural caution overriding its hunger. The mother bear reached the threshold of the storage unit, her massive frame blocking the entire doorway. Her heat signature was barely detectable now, and ice covered most of her fur, but somehow she remained conscious. Through his failing vision, James saw in her eyes the same look he'd recognized in wounded soldiers, the absolute refusal to fall until the mission was complete. Getting the mother bear through the storage unit door was like moving a frozen mountain. Her massive frame, now covered in ice, barely fit through the reinforced entrance. James's military medical training screamed warnings at him. Moving a hypothermia victim this severe risked triggering cardiac arrest, but leaving her outside meant certain death. The cubs responded to their mother's presence immediately. The larger one attempted to move toward her, while the smaller one's heat signature showed a slight increase in core temperature. Through his thermal scope, James could see their heat patterns beginning to sink, a phenomenon he'd observed in his combat medical experience when treating multiple hypothermia victims. His storage unit, initially designed to house military survival gear, had become an impromptu emergency medical facility. The specialized heating systems maintained a careful balance, warm enough to save lives, but not so hot that it would shock their frozen bodies. James had treated hypothermic soldiers before, but never animals of this size with such severe exposure. The mother bear's condition was critical. Her heat signature showed dangerous arrhythmia, her massive heart struggling to maintain circulation through her frozen body. Ice had formed between her fur layers, creating an insulating barrier that now worked against them by slowing the warming. A process. It was a complication James had seen before in Arctic rescue operations, but never on this scale. Working through his own hypothermia, James activated his military-grade medical equipment. Each movement was a battle against his freezing muscles, but his training kept him focused. He began documenting vital signs through his thermal imaging system. Subject 1, adult female grizzly, core temperature approximately 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Subjects 2 and 3, juvenile bears, showing signs of moderate to severe hypothermia. The larger cub had begun actively warming, its heat signature showing improved circulation. But the smaller one remained dangerously cold, its life signs fluctuating. James recognized the pattern from his emergency medicine courses. Sometimes in severe hypothermia cases, the weakest victims crashed just as help arrived, their bodies giving up once the fight for survival appeared over. Outside, the wolf pack's heat signatures remained visible through the thermal scope, but they had retreated to the tree line. Their coordinated hunting behavior had broken down, replaced by cautious observation. The alpha's signature showed it pacing, instinct warring with hunger as it assessed this new situation. The mother bear's breathing had become increasingly labored, her massive chest rising and falling in irregular patterns. James's combat medical training told him she was approaching a critical phase, the point where warming could either save her or trigger a fatal shock response. He'd seen it happen with human hypothermia victims, their bodies unable to handle the transition from frozen to functional. Using techniques adapted from his Arctic rescue experience, James began applying specialized warming packs to specific points on the bears' bodies. areas where major blood vessels ran close to the surface. It was a delicate balance, learned through treating combat casualties in extreme conditions. Too much heat too quickly could be as deadly as the cold itself. The smaller cub suddenly seized, its heat signature showing dangerous fluctuations. The mother bear, despite her own critical condition, responded to her cub's distress. Her heat signature flared briefly as she tried to move toward the sound, maternal instinct still strong even as her body failed. The larger cub pressed closer to its sibling, their combined body heat creating a small pocket of warmth. James's own symptoms were becoming harder to ignore. His vision blurred periodically, and his hands shook as he worked with the medical equipment. The cold had penetrated to his core during the rescue, and now his body was demanding payment for pushing beyond its limits. His military training helped him push through the pain, but he knew he was approaching dangerous levels of hypothermia himself. The storage unit's emergency power systems hummed steadily, maintaining the careful balance of temperature needed for survival. Through his thermal scope, James watched the interplay of heat signatures before him. 3 massive bears and 1 human, all fighting against the cold's lingering grip. His training had taught him that survival often came down to the smallest margins, the tiniest differences between life and death. The next hour became a desperate battle against time and biology. James's military medical training had taught him that the warming phase after severe hypothermia was often more dangerous than the cold itself. As circulation returned to frozen tissue, it could trigger a cascade of potentially lethal complications. The mother bear's condition was deteriorating despite the careful warming measures. Her massive size, initially an advantage against the cold, now worked against her. The thick layers of fur and fat that normally protected her had trapped the freezing temperatures deep in her core. Through his thermal scope, James could see her heart rate becoming increasingly erratic. Subject 1, showing signs of rewarming. Shock, he spoke into his throat mic, continuing to document everything despite his own deteriorating condition. Peripheral circulation improving, but core temperature remains critically low. His voice was hoarse, his words slightly slurred, symptoms of his own advancing hypothermia that his medical training wouldn't let him ignore. The cubs were responding differently to treatment. The larger one had begun showing promising signs of recovery, its heat signature strengthening as circulation returned to its extremities. But the smaller cub's condition remained precarious. Its heat signature showed a dangerous pattern James had seen before in hypothermia victims, the afterdrop phenomenon, where core temperature continues to fall even after warming begins. Using his remaining medical supplies, James implemented what his unit had called staged rewarming, a technique developed for treating multiple cold weather casualties with limited resources. He concentrated the heating packs around the bears, central mass, where the warmth could help stabilize their core temperatures without shocking their systems. The mother bear suddenly convulsed, her massive body shuddering violently. James recognized the symptoms from his emergency medicine training. Her blood chemistry was becoming dangerously unstable as her frozen tissues began to warm. The process was releasing built-up toxins into her bloodstream, a potentially lethal complication of severe hypothermia. The larger cub responded to its mother's distress with a weak cry, stronger than anything it had managed since the rescue began. The sound seemed to reach something deep in the mother bear's consciousness. Her heat signature briefly intensified, maternal instinct once again proving stronger than mere physical limitations. James's own vision was becoming increasingly unreliable, the edges darkening as hypothermia affected his brain function. He forced himself to keep moving, kept focused on the thermal scope's readings. The specialized military equipment was now doing more than just measuring temperature. It was keeping him connected to reality as his mind tried to drift. The smaller cub's condition suddenly worsened. Its heat signature showed its heart rate, dropping dangerously. A complication James had seen claimed the lives of hypothermia victims, just as they seemed to be improving. The mother bear sensed her cub's distress, trying to move despite her own critical condition. The effort sent her vital signs into dangerous territory. Drawing on his combat medical experience, James began implementing emergency protocols he'd developed during Arctic warfare training. Each bear needed slightly different treatment, the mother's mass requiring more gradual warming, the cubs needing more immediate intervention. It was like trying to solve three interconnected puzzles while his own mind was freezing. The storage unit's heating system continued its steady work, but James's thermal scope showed an alarming development. The mother bear's outer temperature was rising, but her core remained dangerously cold. It was a condition he'd seen in severe hypothermia cases, the body beginning to warm unevenly, creating dangerous temperature gradients that could trigger cardiac arrest. Time seemed to move strangely as James fought to save 3 lives while his own hung in the balance. His military training helped him maintain focus, but each movement required increasingly conscious effort. Through his thermal scope, he watched the delicate dance of heat signatures before him, 3 bears and 1 human, all hovering in that narrow space between survival and system failure. The storage unit's emergency lights flickered, a momentary power fluctuation that sent James's tactical training into high alert. His backup generator was struggling against the unprecedented cold, its machinery never designed for temperatures this extreme. Through his thermal scope, he watched the heating system's output waver, threatening to destabilize the careful warming process. Emergency power systems showing strain, he documented, his words becoming harder to form. Implementing backup protocols. His own condition had deteriorated to the point where each movement required intense concentration. The cold had settled deep in his bones, making his trained responses sluggish and unreliable. The mother bear's vital signs suddenly spiked on. His medical monitoring equipment, her massive body convulsed as warming blood began reaching previously frozen tissue. James recognized the symptoms from his combat medicine experience. She was entering the most dangerous phase of recovery, where improved circulation could either save her or trigger catastrophic shock. The larger cub had begun showing more consistent signs of improvement, its heat signature stabilizing as proper circulation returned. But the movement had cost it precious energy, and its temperature began to drop again. The smaller cub remained critical, its life signs fluctuating between extremely weak and nearly undetectable. Their conditions were linked in ways James's medical training helped him understand but couldn't fully address. His thermal scope captured a new concern. The mother bear's heart rhythm was becoming dangerously irregular. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The uneven warming had created temperature gradients in her body that threatened to trigger cardiac arrest. James had seen this same phenomenon claim the lives of hypothermia victims in the field, their bodies unable to handle the stress of rewarming. Using the last of his specialized medical equipment, he began implementing what his unit had called crisis intervention protocol, a last resort technique for treating severe hypothermia when standard methods failed. The procedure carried its own risks, but his combat experience told him they were out of safer options. The smaller cub suddenly seized, its tiny body arching as its muscles spasmed. The mother bear, despite her own critical condition, responded with a surge of movement that sent James's medical alerts into a frenzy. Her maternal instinct was fighting against the very treatments trying to save her life. The larger cub pressed closer to its sibling, their combined heat signatures creating patterns James had never seen in his medical experience. His vision blurred again, worse this time. The cold had penetrated so deeply that even his military-grade thermal gear couldn't prevent his core temperature from dropping to dangerous levels. His training helped him recognize the symptoms of severe hypothermia in himself, the confusion, the tremors, the overwhelming urge to sleep. But that same training kept him moving, kept him focused on the lives depending on his intervention. The storage unit's power fluctuated again, longer this time. The heating system's output dropped dangerously, threatening to undo hours of careful warming. James's tactical mind ran through scenarios, calculating power consumption against remaining generator capacity. The numbers weren't good. They were running out of time in more ways than one. The mother bear's condition reached a critical point. Her heat signature showed the warming blood finally reaching her frozen core, triggering a cascade of physiological responses. James had seen this moment before in human hypothermia victims. It was often the point where they either turned the corner toward recovery or crashed completely. In a bear of this size, the outcome was impossible to predict. Time seemed to compress and expand strangely as James fought against his own failing body to monitor 3 others. His military medical training had prepared him for treating multiple casualties in extreme conditions, but nothing had prepared him for this specific combination of challenges. Through his increasingly unreliable vision, he watched the interplay of heat signatures before him, each one representing a life balanced on the edge of survival. The smaller cub seizing suddenly stopped, its heat signature dropping to barely detectable levels. The mother bear's response was immediate and profound. Her vital signs spiked dangerously as she tried to reach her cub. The larger cub's condition began to deteriorate in response to its siblings' distress. James realized with clarity born of desperate experience that the next few moments would determine whether any of them survived the night. The backup generator failed with a sound James recognized from his military experience. The death rattle of machinery pushed beyond its limits. The storage unit's primary heating system shut down immediately, plunging them into a darkness broken only by the eerie glow of his thermal scope. The temperature began dropping immediately, threatening to undo everything they'd fought so hard to achieve. Primary systems failing, he forced the words out through chattering teeth. Implementing emergency protocols Delta 9. The military designation was automatic, though no training manual had ever covered this specific situation. His hands shook as he activated his last remaining power source, a portable tactical generator designed for field hospital operations. The mother bear's heat signature showed an immediate response to the temperature drop. Her massive body, still dangerously cold at its core, began losing the precious warmth they'd worked so hard to restore. The cub's conditions deteriorated even faster, their smaller bodies unable to retain heat without external support. The larger cub's previously stable vital signs began to waver. Drawing on his Arctic survival training, James began implementing what his unit had called a zero-resource survival strategy, techniques developed for situations when all standard equipment failed. He activated chemical heating packs he'd held in reserve, knowing they were now the only barrier between life and death for all of them. The smaller cub's condition became critical again, its heat signature barely registering on his thermal scope. The mother bear sensed her cub's distress, her own vital signs spiking dangerously as she tried to move. The effort sent her heart rhythm into dangerous territory, patterns James recognized from treating severe hypothermia cases in combat zones. His own body was failing. The cold had penetrated so deeply that even basic movements became monumental tasks. His military medical training helped him recognize the symptoms of advanced hypothermia in himself. The confusion, the loss of fine motor control, the dangerous sense of detachment. But that same training kept him moving, kept him focused on the lives depending on his intervention. The portable generator's output was minimal, enough to power his medical monitoring equipment and provide some heat, but not enough to maintain the careful warming process they'd established. Through his thermal scope, James watched as the bears' heat signatures began to fade again, all their progress threatening to slip away in minutes. Using techniques he'd learned in extreme weather survival courses, he began creating an emergency heat shelter within the storage unit. Every piece of insulating material, every thermal barrier, every bit of equipment that could generate even minimal warmth was pressed into service. His movements were clumsy, his coordination failing, but his training kept him methodical. The mother bear's condition suddenly deteriorated. Her heat signature showed dangerous arrhythmia, her heart struggling to maintain circulation as the cold began to reclaim her body. The cubs responded to their mother's distress, their own vital signs becoming erratic. James recognized the pattern from his emergency medicine experience. Multiple casualties affecting each other's conditions, creating a downward spiral. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, hypothermia affecting his brain function. The thermal scope's display became his only reliable connection to reality, its readouts telling a story of 4 lives balanced on the edge of survival. His training helped him focus on the essential data, core temperatures, heart rates, circulation patterns, while his own body screamed for attention. The larger cub suddenly moved, pressing closer to its sibling and mother. The movement cost precious energy, but it created something James's thermal scope captured in stark detail, a small pocket of shared warmth between the 3 bears. Their combined body heat, minimal as it was, created a microclimate that might help them survive until he could restore power. Time became fluid as James fought against his own failing systems to save 3 others. His combat medical experience had taught him about crisis management, about making impossible decisions when every option seemed wrong. Through his increasingly unreliable vision, he watched the delicate balance of heat signatures before him, knowing the next few minutes would determine whether any of them survived until dawn. The portable generator's light flickered again, weaker this time. James's tactical training told him they had minutes of power left at most. Through his thermal scope, he watched as the temperature in the storage unit continued to drop, threatening to pull them all back into the killing cold they'd fought so hard to escape. "Emergency power critical," he managed to log, his voice barely a whisper now. "Implementing survival protocol Echo 7. The military designation felt distant, as if from another life. His own body temperature had dropped dangerously low, making even basic movement a monumental effort. But his training kept him going, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought was failing. The mother bear's condition had become precarious again. Her massive body, still dangerously cold at its core, shuddered with each labored breath. The cubs pressed against her, their small forms seeking warmth that she could barely provide. Through his thermal scope, James watched their heat signatures merge and fade, 3 lives interconnected in their desperate fight for survival. Using the last reserves of his military medical training, he began implementing what his unit had called absolute crisis protocols. Techniques reserved for situations when all standard options were exhausted. Every scrap of insulating material, every potential source of heat, every technique he'd ever learned for surviving extreme conditions was put into action. The smaller cub's heat signature suddenly weakened dramatically. Its tiny body, already pushed far beyond normal limits, was beginning to shut down. The mother bear sensed her cub's failing condition, her own vital signs showing dangerous spikes. As she tried to respond, the larger cub moved closer, pressing against its sibling in an instinctive attempt to share what little warmth it had left. James's vision had narrowed to a series of grainy green images on his thermal scope. Hypothermia had affected his cognitive functions to the point where even reading the temperature displays required intense concentration. His military training helped him focus on essential data: core temperatures, vital signs, critical thresholds, while everything else faded into a cold-induced haze. The portable generator gave one final sputter and died, plunging them into complete darkness. The sudden loss of power sent James's tactical instincts into overdrive. In the pitch black, he could hear the bear's labored breathing, feel the temperature dropping with lethal speed. His thermal scope, running on its last battery reserves, showed their heat signatures growing dangerously faint. Drawing on his Arctic warfare experience, he began the final phase of what his unit had called zero-option survival, techniques developed for situations when all equipment failed and only human resources remained. His own body heat, minimal as it was, became part of the survival equation. Every scrap of knowledge, every survival technique, every lesson learned in the harshest conditions on Earth came into play. The mother bear's heart rhythm became dangerously irregular. Her heat signature showed patterns James recognized from his combat medical experience, the final stages of systemic failure. The cubs' conditions deteriorated in response to their mother's distress, their small bodies unable to maintain even minimal warmth without external support. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. James's training helped him track the passage of minutes through changes in the bear's breathing patterns, through subtle shifts in temperature that his freezing body could still detect. His thermal scope's battery warning began to flash, threatening to remove his last window into their conditions. Outside, the storm's fury reached new heights. The storage unit's walls creaked under the assault of 100-mile-per-hour winds. Through his failing vision, James watched as the bear's heat signatures began to synchronize in a way he'd never seen before. 3 distinct patterns merging into one as their bodies fought together against the cold. His own consciousness began to waver, hypothermia pushing him toward a dangerous precipice. His military training screamed at him to stay awake, to keep fighting, but even years of specialized experience couldn't completely overcome basic biology. Through the thermal scope's dimming display, he watched the delicate dance of heat and cold that would determine whether any of them survived until dawn. The first hint of dawn came not through any window, but through James's thermal scope as it detected a subtle change in the external temperature readings. His military training helped him recognize the significance. The storm was finally beginning to weaken, but they were far from safe. The scope's battery warning flashed more urgently now, its display growing dimmer with each passing minute. 0400 hours, he logged mechanically, his voice barely audible. External temperature beginning to moderate. All subjects critical but stable. The military precision of his report was automatic, though his mind struggled to form the words. Hypothermia had affected his speech, making each syllable a battle against frozen vocal cords. The mother bear's condition had reached a crucial threshold. Her massive body, having burned through every reserve of energy, maintained only the most basic functions. But her heat signature showed something remarkable. Her core temperature had finally stopped dropping. Through his failing scope, James could see her body's desperate adaptations beginning to take effect. Using his last coherent thoughts, he began implementing what his Arctic survival training called threshold maintenance. Techniques designed to help casualties survive the dangerous transition period between crisis and recovery. Every remaining scrap of insulation, every bit of residual heat, had to be preserved and maximized. The smaller cub suddenly moved, a stronger motion than anything it had shown in hours. Its heat signature, though still dangerously weak, showed the first signs of true stabilization. The mother bear responded to her cub's movement with a soft sound, not the pained noises of earlier, but something closer to her natural vocalizations. The larger cub pressed closer, their shared body heat creating a pattern that James's thermal scope captured in stark detail. His own condition teetered on the edge of consciousness. The cold had penetrated so deeply that even his extensive cold weather training couldn't completely overcome its effects. His vision faded in and out, the thermal scope's display becoming an intermittent window into their survival. But years of military discipline kept him focused on the essential data: temperatures, vital signs, critical thresholds. The storm outside began to change character, its howling taking on a different pitch. Through the storage unit's walls, James could hear the wind's intensity finally beginning to decrease. His tactical training helped him track these changes, recognizing them as signs that the worst of the Arctic blast was passing. But the danger was far from over. Drawing on his combat medical experience, he continued monitoring the bear's conditions. The mother's heart rhythm had finally stabilized, though still dangerously slow. The cub's heat signatures showed their bodies beginning to generate warmth again, their natural survival mechanisms slowly reactivating. It was progress, but so fragile that any disruption could reverse it. The thermal scope's battery warning became constant, its display barely visible. James forced his freezing mind to memorize the last readings, knowing he would soon be blind to their vital signs. His military training had prepared him for equipment failure, but losing this window into their conditions felt like losing a lifeline. Time moved strangely in the darkness, marked only by subtle changes in the bear's breathing patterns and the gradually moderating temperature. James's training helped him track these changes, translating them into meaningful data even as his own body fought against the cold's lingering effects. Outside, the first true light of dawn began to affect the external temperature readings. Through his nearly dead thermal scope, James watched as the storage unit's ambient temperature began to rise by fractions of degrees. The mother bear sensed these changes, her massive body responding to signals too subtle for human perception. His consciousness wavered again, but his military discipline forced him to stay alert. Through the scope's last moments of power, he watched the bear's heat signatures one final time. The patterns he saw told a story of incredible resilience. 3 beings who had faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. As the scope's display finally faded to black, James realized that the next phase of their survival would depend on factors beyond even his extensive training. As the first real light filtered through the storage unit's small window, James faced a new set of challenges. Without his thermal scope, he had to rely on his military training and basic observation to monitor the bear's conditions. The darkness that had hidden the full reality of their situation was lifting, revealing just how close they had come to disaster. The mother bear's massive form became visible in the growing light. Ice still clung to her fur in places, but her breathing had strengthened noticeably. Her eyes, when they opened, showed more awareness than they had since the rescue began. James's combat medical experience told him this was a crucial moment. The transition from survival to recovery was often when casualties were most vulnerable. Dawn assessment. He spoke into his dead throat mic from pure habit, his voice stronger but still rough. Subjects showing initial signs of recovery, primary concerns, rewarming shock, cardiac complications, potential tissue damage. Even without power to record his observations, the military precision helped focus his thoughts through his own lingering hypothermia. The cubs began stirring more frequently as natural light filled the space. The larger one made several attempts to raise its head, each movement stronger than the last. The smaller cub remained more lethargic, but its breathing had developed a steady rhythm that James's medical training recognized as a positive sign. Their mother watched every movement with increasing alertness. Using his last reserves of strength, James began implementing what his unit had called recovery phase protocols, techniques for managing casualties as they transitioned out of critical condition. Without power for his medical equipment, he had to rely on visual cues and physical signs that his training helped him interpret. The storage unit's temperature continued to rise slowly as dawn progressed, but this created new risks. His Arctic survival training had taught him that too rapid warming could trigger dangerous complications in hypothermia victims. The bears' massive bodies, still dangerously cold at their cores, needed to warm gradually to avoid shock. The mother bear suddenly shifted position, a stronger movement than anything she'd managed in hours. The motion sent her cubs rolling slightly, triggering the first normal response James had seen from them. They immediately pressed back against her warmth. It was a small thing, but his experience with wildlife rehabilitation told him it was significant. Natural instincts were returning. His own condition was improving marginally as daylight brought slightly warmer temperatures. The violent shivering had subsided, but the deep cold remained in his bones. His military training helped him recognize the danger signs in himself, the lingering confusion, the stiffness in his joints, the dangerous urge to sleep. Recovery would be a slow process for all of them. Through the window, he could see the storm had finally broken. The lethal wind that had driven the bears to his cabin had dropped to manageable levels. Sunlight reflected blindingly off the fresh snow, creating an almost painful brightness after the long hours of darkness. His tactical assessment told him they had survived the worst, but the next few hours would still be critical. The larger cub attempted to nurse for the first time since their ordeal began. The mother bear's response was immediate and profound. She shifted to accommodate her cub with more coordination than she'd shown in hours. The smaller cub, though still weaker, showed interest in the activity. James recognized these behaviors from his wildlife studies as crucial signs of family bond survival. Time began moving more normally as full daylight established itself. James's training helped him maintain focus despite his exhaustion, watching for signs of complications he'd seen develop in other cold weather casualties. The bear's conditions continued to improve gradually, but he knew from experience that recovery from severe hypothermia was never a straight path. The mother bear's eyes met his again, but the look had changed. The desperate plea he'd seen the night before had been replaced by something else, a wary awareness that told him her natural instincts were returning. His wildlife experience told him this was both a positive sign and a warning. As her strength returned, so would her natural defensive behaviors. By mid-morning, the world outside had transformed. The brutal storm that had pushed nature to its limits had given way to an almost surreal stillness. James stood at his cabin's window, his military training helping him assess both the aftermath and their chances for full recovery. The temperature outside had risen to a manageable 10 degrees Fahrenheit, practically tropical compared to the lethal cold they'd endured. "Final status report," he spoke quietly, maintaining the documentation habit despite his non-functioning. "Equipment, all subjects stabilized, mother showing increasing alertness, cubs demonstrating normal behavioral patterns." His voice was stronger now, though exhaustion colored every word. His own core temperature had finally returned to normal, though the memory of that bone-deep cold would stay with him forever. The mother bear had regained much of her natural wariness. Her movements, while still showing the effects of their ordeal, had become more controlled, more purposeful. Through the observation window between his cabin and the storage unit, James watched her methodically checking her cubs, behavior his wildlife training recognized as a return to normal maternal care. Both cubs were now moving regularly, their recovery progressing faster than their mothers, a pattern James had seen before in his combat medical experience. Young bodies, when they survived extreme conditions, often bounced back more quickly than adults. The smaller cub, whose survival had seemed most doubtful, had begun playing with its sibling in brief bursts of energy. Using his satellite phone, which had finally regained signal, James contacted the regional wildlife authorities. His military precision helped him convey the situation clearly. 3 bears, recovered from severe hypothermia, would need safe passage back to suitable habitat once they were strong enough to travel. The response was a mixture of disbelief and professional interest. No one had documented bears surviving such extreme conditions before. The mother bear's increasing strength presented new challenges. His experience with wildlife rehabilitation told him they were approaching a critical transition. Soon, her natural instincts would overcome any lingering acceptance of human proximity. The same protective drive that had helped her survive the night would make her dangerous as her strength returned. Drawing on his tactical training, James began preparing for their eventual departure. The weather forecast showed favorable conditions, clear skies and gradually warming temperatures. His wildlife knowledge helped him identify several potential den sites in the nearby ridges, areas where the bears could complete their recovery in natural surroundings. By late afternoon, the mother bear's behavior signaled she was ready. She had begun pacing the storage unit, her movements showing increasing strength and purpose. The cubs watched her alertly, their own bodies showing remarkable recovery. Through the observation window, James could see their fur had regained its natural luster, no longer matted with ice and snow. With careful precision, born from years of working in dangerous conditions, James implemented the final phase of what he mentally called Operation Bear Recovery. Using his tactical training, he created a clear exit path from the storage unit, removed anything that might startle or confuse them, and prepared to give them the space they needed to leave on their own terms. The mother bear sensed the change. Immediately, when James opened the storage unit's outer door, she moved with surprising grace for an animal her size. Her cubs stayed close, their movements showing strength that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. At the threshold, she paused, her massive head turning toward where James stood at a safe distance. In that moment, time seemed to stop. Her eyes met his one final time, and James saw something that transcended the natural barrier between human and wildlife. There was recognition there, an awareness that went beyond mere animal instinct. Then she turned away, leading her cubs into the brilliant afternoon sun. James watched through his cabin window as the bear family made their way into the forest. Their dark forms moved with increasing confidence through the snow-covered landscape, the cubs bouncing around their mother in brief displays of renewed energy. Just before they disappeared into the tree line, the mother bear paused again, her form silhouetted against the white landscape. Then they were gone, leaving only tracks in the snow as evidence of their extraordinary encounter. That night, as James finally allowed himself to rest, he reflected on how life in the wilderness constantly challenged everything he thought he knew. His military training had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing had prepared him for the moment when survival meant breaking every rule he'd learned. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest acts of courage came not from following protocols, but from knowing when to set them aside in service of something greater than ourselves. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.